You are a monk in the dim morning light of Westminster Abbey. The year is 1396, and the cold bites through your robes as you stand near the altar. Candles flicker. Incense clings to the damp stone. You hear the rustle of silk and the hushed murmurs of courtiers. A wedding is about to begin. But not just any wedding. The groom? King Richard II, nearly 30 years old. The bride? A child from France, so small she must be lifted from her horse. Her shoes barely touch the blackened flagstones. She walks, or rather stumbles, beside the king, her hand engulfed in his. You clutch your prayer book and try not to show what you feel. You have seen many royal unions. But this feels different. She cannot be more than 6. And yet here she is, draped in pearls, cloaked in politics. You raise your eyes to the vaulted ceiling and whisper a prayer. Because deep in your chest something says, this girl will not be spared. To understand how a 6-year-old girl became Queen of England, you must understand the world that raised her. Isabella of Valois was born into a France crumbling beneath the weight of its own crown. Her father, King Charles VI, drifted in and out of madness, sometimes loving and lucid, other times convinced he was made of glass, screaming at shadows only he could see. Her mother, Queen Isabella of Bavaria, ruled from behind a veil of cosmetics and cunning, trading smiles at court for survival behind closed doors. And through it all, war never left the horizon. The 100 Years' War had dragged on for decades, a brutal, expensive, exhausting feud between two kingdoms that barely remembered how peace felt. Entire villages vanished. Treasuries emptied. Families lost sons before they ever became men. Isabella was not born to marry for love. She was born to end a war. When peace talks between England and France began, her name was whispered like a key, a delicate child, a daughter of 2 crowns, an offering to settle blood-stained debts. England's King Richard II had lost his first wife to the plague. He had no heir, no treaty, and no time. His enemies circled, and his treasury bled. France offered Isabella, with a dowry large enough to rescue a kingdom and a truce long enough to let it breathe. There was only one problem. Isabella was 6. Even by medieval standards, this was not normal. But normal had no place in the halls of kings. She would be raised in England, groomed for a crown she could barely carry, and used to stitch together 2 nations. She would belong to the peace. But peace in her world was never free. Before she was ever a queen, Isabella was a quiet shadow in the corridors of the Louvre Palace. Born into opulence yet starved for stability, she learned early that silence was safer than questions. Her father, King Charles VI of France, was a man divided. On his good days he told her stories and called her his little dove. On his bad days he howled through locked doors, claimed assassins hid in the walls, and refused to let anyone touch him, convinced that even a breath might shatter his glass body. Isabella was too young to understand madness, but old enough to recognize danger. The servants' eyes told her when to hide. Her mother, Queen Isabella, taught her how to smile without blinking. Appearances were everything in a court ruled by fear and fantasy. She was just 5 when she realized she was being watched, not as a child but as a symbol. Ambassadors bowed lower to her than to the other royal children. Seamstresses took her measurements with hands that trembled slightly. Whispered conversations stopped when she entered the room. One morning, her nurse sat beside her with a new lesson, English phrases. You'll need them soon, ma petite reine. That's when Isabella understood. Something had been decided. Not by her but about her. The gowns became heavier. The tutors sterner. Her dolls were boxed away and replaced with embroidery hoops and miniature prayer books. Her mother began calling her my little queen, and Isabella, still small enough to cry at night, nodded like she understood. She didn't know where England was. She didn't know who Richard was. But she knew how to smile at strangers and hold still when they pinned jewels into her hair. Because in the palace where love cracked under madness, she had already learned how to disappear in plain sight. The sea crossing was cold and gray, and Isabella clutched a doll she had been told not to bring. It was the only thing still hers. By the time she reached the English shore, even her name sounded different, softened and reshaped by foreign tongues. She was 7 now, and her wedding dress had taken 3 women to lift. Calais was not London, but it was English enough for a ceremony that needed neutral ground. In the great stone hall, she stood on a cushion so she could reach the altar beside Richard II, the king they said would be her husband. He knelt to meet her eye level, smiled, lifted her veil with fingers that trembled slightly. His voice was gentle when he repeated the vows, like a teacher reciting a lesson, not a man binding a child to a crown. Witnesses claimed he was kind, that he looked at her like one might look at a wounded bird. But none of that changed what she was, a child dressed in gold, paraded across the channel as the price of peace. The coronation came later, grander and more brutal in its beauty. Westminster Abbey flooded with light and incense, bells clanging like victory and warning. Thousands came to see the girl queen, crushed against each other just to glimpse her jeweled head. She wore a crown so heavy it left marks on her forehead. Her train dragged behind her, carried by duchesses whose smiles were tight and cold. When she turned to wave, just as she had practiced, her hand shook. In the feasting halls afterward, she sat beside Richard, picking at food she didn't recognize, smiling when told, bowing when cued. And somewhere in the din of music and celebration, she realized something quietly devastating. They weren't celebrating her. They were celebrating what she represented, a treaty. A temporary silence between kingdoms. No one noticed the little girl underneath the velvet and pearls. Westminster Palace was a maze of stone and whispers, and Isabella learned early to listen more than she spoke. Her days followed a careful rhythm. Language lessons in the morning, embroidery in the afternoon, evening prayers in a candlelit chapel that echoed when she breathed. She began to speak English with a gentle accent, her voice soft but sure. She learned which fork to use, how to hold a goblet without shaking, and when to lower her gaze during court debates. Her tutors praised her discipline. But discipline was never her real strength. Observation was. She noticed how the nobles spoke when Richard wasn't in the room, how the tone shifted, how alliances flickered like candlelight. She watched the servants too, especially the ones who tried not to be seen. She understood quickly, this was a world that loved appearances but lived by secrets. Her closest companion became Margaret Holland, a girl just 2 years older but already fluent in every rule of survival. Margaret whispered things no tutor would dare teach, who could be trusted, who couldn't, what every sideways glance meant. Richard's crown is heavy, she once told Isabella, and the people holding it up are waiting for him to stumble. Isabella began to read more than history. She studied the space between sentences. She traced maps with her fingertips, learning the coastlines of countries she barely remembered. She wrote careful letters home, never too honest, never too empty. She was still a child. But not the same child who'd clutched her doll on the shore. She was becoming something else. Not quite English. Not quite French. Not quite queen. Not quite girl. Something in between, something quiet, sharp, and watching. The silence came first. Not from Isabella but from the palace. Servants stopped whispering near her door. Margaret visited less. The gifts from Richard stopped arriving. No more books, no music boxes, no stories from foreign lands. When she asked where the king had gone, no one answered directly. But Isabella had learned to read between lines. Something was breaking. One morning, half her English attendants were gone. By nightfall she was being moved, not with fanfare but under guard. Her carriage was shuttered tight, her route lit by torches instead of celebration. When she asked, "Where are we going?" the only answer came from Margaret, who clutched her hand and said, "To the tower. For safety." Safety. The word didn't fit the sound of iron gates clanging shut. Her new rooms were cold and too quiet. Guards stood outside. The windows didn't open. Her French attendants remained, but they looked frightened even when they smiled. 2 days later Richard came. He looked smaller, disheveled, haunted. He knelt beside her chair, like he had once before, but this time his voice shook. "There are men who say I am no longer king," he whispered. "And I cannot protect you as I once did." Isabella listened. She didn't cry, because she understood something awful. She was no longer a queen. She was a question mark, a threat, a pawn, a bargaining chip dressed in silk. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long a child could be forgotten before she disappeared entirely. Months passed. Walls didn't speak, but they remembered. Isabella remained in the tower, not as prisoner, not as queen, but as something blurred and unfinished. Rumors came and went like cold wind under doors. Some whispered that Richard had been killed. Others claimed he'd been starved or vanished. But no one told her the truth. When Henry Bolingbroke, now crowned Henry IV, came to visit her chambers, she rose and curtsied with perfect grace. Her crown had been taken, but not her posture. He looked at her like a puzzle, unsure whether to treat her as threat, child, or foreign guest. "What will become of me?" she asked plainly, her voice clear. "That," he replied, "depends on what use peace has for you now." Weeks later, a deal was struck. She would return to France. Not as queen. Not as widow. Not as prisoner. But as a girl the English crown had no more use for. They expected her to leave broken. Instead, she stood tall as she stepped onto the ship, the same sea beneath her but a different girl crossing it. She had entered England as a symbol. Now she left as something sharper, a survivor with secrets. And a story the world would not soon forget. Isabella died young, just 20 years old, her body worn down by childbirth and years of quiet endurance. She never ruled a kingdom, never led an army. But those who knew her remembered something more powerful. They remembered her clarity, her silence that saw everything, her ability to walk through royal courts like a ghost made of steel and silk. In France, she rebuilt a life on her terms. She remarried with choice, bore children with love, and whispered bedtime stories in both English and French, reminders of a girl who once belonged to two nations and neither at all. History tried to forget her. No monuments bear her name. No empire rose or fell because of her will. But in a world built to use girls like her and throw them away, Isabella of Valois did something quietly radical. She endured. She outlived their plans. And she left as more than a queen. She left as herself.